Right, welcome back. Welcome. Okay, quick biscuit audit. Has everyone who needs biscuits got biscuits? Yes, and the enthusiasm level is rising for the biscuits, which means it's working out. I'm delighted. I must apologize. I sent you off to your break like an old schoolmistress. I said, it's only your time you're wasting. What a lovely way to set a mood in a room that was. I don't know what I was doing. Anyway, we're back. We're ready for our last talk before the lunch break. Where to begin? Coconuts. On the outside, they're kind of rough and they're unforgiving, but once they've been processed and unfurled, they're rich, they're rewarding inside. That's what comes through in a nice biscuit, the coconut aspect of them. And it really puts me in mind of the audio API, particularly if it's been driven by data, because that's rough. It might not be that pleasing, like the skin of a coconut. Is it a skin? Anjana doesn't know. Anjana doesn't care. The rind. Cool, yeah, we're going with the rind. Maybe it's a husk. I don't know. It's a husk. Okay, good. I'm glad we got through rind. Social media was going to be ablaze with us talking about coconut rind. So yeah, this is obviously the right biscuit for this talk, particularly since it's encoded with a message. And if we're going to be taking data and pushing it through the audio API, I don't know what I'm talking about. There's a nice biscuit, eat the biscuit. We're really lucky to have Anjana here. I don't know if anyone has seen Anjana's work before. She's done, yes, absolutely. She's done wonderful work on explaining functional programming, and I just recall seeing a number of Anjana's talks where my mind was a little bit blown, and I realized that I was hearing from someone who understands things on a much deeper level than I do or will. She's a very, very talented engineer, based in Berlin, spending quite a bit of time in San Francisco as well, but we managed to get her here today. So you've been doing a great job with this so far. I trust that will continue as you go absolutely bananas. To welcome to the stage, Anjana Vakil.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, hey, all day, for having me here. And yeah, my name is Anjana. I'm an independent software developer, full stack, JavaScript, TypeScript sort of stuff, and a developer educator. And today, I would like to talk to you about making waves with the web. We're going to be diving into a bit of audio synthesis and data sonification with the WebAudio API. And this is an area that I personally felt motivated to learn more about because I've worked in data visualization a little bit, and why should visuals get all of the fun? We have so many other senses. There's so many other attributes of our sensory experience that we can map data values to. So sonification is analogous to data visualization, a way for us to breathe a bit more life and energy into data by giving it representation through sound waves. So there's a lot that can be said about data sonification. Have folks heard of cool sonifications before? Anybody encountered cool people doing sonification work? A couple of hands. But this is a pretty new field to me. But there is this one project that I've had burning a hole in the back of my mind for years. And this is an artistic analog data sonification project by an artist named Quintron in New Orleans, I believe is where they're based, called Weather for the Blind. Before I talk too much more about it, let's have a listen, shall we? Come on, internet. Okay. Let it wash over you. Trippy, right? Okay, so as I turn this down a little bit, what we are listening to is an analog synthesizer, which you can sort of see in this backdrop photo, that is essentially a bunch of circuits and you could imagine some knobs hooked up to them, but instead of a human twiddling the knobs like we would see at a cool electronic music expo, there's all the way in the background a weather station. A little station with a bunch of sensors for like wind speed and temperature and rainfall and all of these different atmospheric conditions that is hooked up to essentially twiddling the knobs, playing this drone synthesizer. So if you've encountered synthesizers as like, you know, the 80s keyboard where you press a note and you hear something and you stop and the sound stops, that's not the kind of synthesizer we're talking about here. It's a drone synth, meaning it's constantly creating noise no matter what. And it sort of creates this very atmospheric soundscape that I think is just like so cool. I love listening to this while I work because there's no lyrics, it's not too distracting. And for a long time, I've just been so curious about how this works. So, okay, enough, thank you. All right, so back to the slides. So what is happening here, as we said, this is another instance of this project that's in upstate New York, but a little easier to see. We have a bunch of different parameters from our data sensors, things like wind speed, things like the amount of UV radiation, et cetera. And those are mapped to different parameters, or we could think about it kind of like knobs, to twiddle on this complex instrument that a very brilliant sound artist has created to sound good, to have like nice notes and nice qualities. Now, there's a huge amount of art that goes into this, but I, as a non-artist, was like, well, maybe I can at least do something that's in this direction in the browser, because I'm pretty sure the browser can make noise. And so for a little more context, I found myself this past fall in Brooklyn, New York, at an amazing place called the Recurse Center. Has anybody heard of the Recurse Center? Not? Yeah, okay. Couple of hands, amazing. Well, the rest of you are gonna know about it now because it is a fantastic place where people who are into programming, not necessarily professionals, but programmers of all sorts and shapes, can get together and work on becoming better at programming, whatever that means. So there's no classes, there's no curriculum, it's all self-directed, it's all just a bunch of curious, motivated folks who are excited about code coming together and doing whatever projects they want to for 6 or 12 weeks in the company of other curious, interested people. And so there's a fun thing we do at the Recurse Center called Impossible Stuff Day. And I was like, perfect! I have the perfect impossible project. I have no idea how to make an ambient drone synthesizer in the browser that's powered by the weather, but we're gonna try. And that is essentially the background of this project that I'm gonna help you understand the beginnings that I was helped to understand by my cohort at the Recurse Center of how we could possibly do this with the web. So the first step is to synthesize some audio. Draw the rest of the owl, right? We're already there. And so if you are interested in weaving a soundscape out of a bunch of different audio waves, because that's all that sound is a bunch of different frequencies that hit our eardrums and give us feelings. This is a really, really complex field that you could totally spend the rest of your life learning. I did not spend the rest of my life learning it. I spent the last couple of months. So this is essentially a very crash course from someone who has just had a crash course. So if you start poking around and be like, how do I do this on my computer? You might come across something called a modular synthesis studio or a modular synthesizer emulator. And a really popular one is called VCVRack. This is like free software that you can run on cross-platform. And what it gives you is essentially a digital emulator of what's called a modular synthesizer that you can see in the background here, which is essentially a bunch of boxes that each do one kind of focused thing to transform the sound signal. And then you take a bunch of cables and you hook up the outputs of one box into the inputs of the next, just like plugging data through a bunch of functions. And what you get is a bunch of cables that are sort of patching sound through a bunch of modules. And in putting together all of these different modules in a very bespoke, artistic way, you create your own patch, which is like your own special sound instrument kind of thing. And the digital version of this is just like, okay, forget the physical boxes and the physical wires, but we'll give you little graphical boxes with knobs and graphical wires that you can use to put all these pieces together. And so it's like, okay, that's a lot of knobs. I don't know what any of those things mean. And as you start poking through learning resources, if you're like me, it's like, oh my God, so jargon, much scare. Wow, like there's all these acronyms that I don't understand. There's a bunch of regular sounding words that have totally specific meanings in the audio domain. And so it can be very overwhelming and very confusing. At least it was for me. And so what we're going to try to do is demystify a bit of this today. And one of the very, very helpful tools I found for demystifying this process is there's a free course out there that one of my RC cohorts turned me onto by an artist named Sarah Bell Reed, very cool electronic music artist, who has this free course that's sort of like an intro to sound synthesis. Your first synth patch, it's called. And this uses VCV Rack, that giant bunch of knobs and things you can start working with here. But we're not going to be using VCV Rack, but we are going to be using what I think is a really, really brilliant, simple framework that Sarah Bell Reed explains, which is a 3-step process to building your own synthetic soundscape, which is, first, make some sound. Get some waves that you can then do something with, sort of like your raw material. Then, just like a sculptor would sculpt a chunk of clay, you want to shape that sound and start giving it a little bit more character, sort of personality to it. And then to add some interest and some dynamics into it, we want to start moving that sound in different ways, either manually or, as we're going to look at, automatically using some tricks of the trade. So this is the process that we're going to walk through in the context of the WebAudio API, because we don't need a bunch of physical boxes. We don't need even a bunch of virtual boxes in a separate program that we have to download and install. We already have our web browser. And thanks to the WebAudio API, which has been, according to MDN, available across browsers since April 2021. I thought it was older than that, but it's really possible to do so much, pretty much anything you could put your mind to, audio-wise, in the browser. So I was like, great, I know a JavaScript. I can do this. Let's figure it out. It's a big API. It has a lot of stuff in it, and there's a lot of complexity. And as I said, you very quickly get into, like, you could spend your whole life thinking about this stuff. However, what we've got is an amazing project that I just stumbled upon the other day, and I am so happy it exists. And I wish I had had it past fall at the Recurse Center, but this developer by the name of Alex Chris has created this awesome platform called the WebAudio Studio, which essentially allows us to visualize, boost font a little bit, can we see that? To visualize what's going on when we work with the WebAudio API. So we're going to type some code on the left, and then we're going to get a visual depiction of the audio graph, so sort of what are the little modules that the sound is being patched through on the right. And so this is at webaudio.studio. So when we want to work with the WebAudio API, the first thing we need is an audio context. This is kind of analogous to like your Canvas 2D context or your WebGL context or something like that. So we're going to work with this context to do all of the stuff that we want to do. Now, minor caveat, we don't want our web pages screaming at us before we have consented to let them play audio. So whenever you're creating an audio context, you have to wait until the user has made some kind of interaction with the page. And this is something that is a little bit of a gotcha that kind of tripped me up a couple of times. But in any case, so when we create an audio context, what we get is something called an audio destination. You could sort of think about this as like a like the sink where your audio signal is going to, and that's ultimately going to be your speakers or your headphones or whatever your sound output is. Right now, nothing is happening because all we have is a destination and we're not going anywhere towards that destination. But later, we're going to be able to access the destination as context.destination. So we'll just put that in our toolkit for later. And just for, I'm going to rename that CTX for brevity. And so now we're set up, and now we can think about our first step of making sound. So in order to make sound, we need to make waves. And we can do that in our analog world jargon with something called a voltage-controlled oscillator. Now here, we're working digitally. We're not going to really be thinking about voltage. We're going to be using zeros and ones to drive it. But in the good old days of like circuits doing all of this audio synthesis, that's where it comes from. So the abbreviation VCO is something that you'll see in like VCV Rack, for example. And so an oscillator is essentially something that is moving back and forth at a particular rate, and how fast it's moving creates a wave with something that we can hear, potentially, if it's in the right range, as the pitch of a particular note. So this is what we can do with the Web API, if I can find my, Studio again. Okay, so if we want to create a oscillator, we can use the aptly named create oscillator method on our audio context, which then gives us, I have to call it, gives us an oscillator node. Now, right now, we have an oscillator node is what we call a source, so there's nothing going into it. It is outputting something. And right now, it's not outputting it to anywhere, so we need to connect it to our destination in order to hook them up. So if I capture this as os, let's say, then I can call os connect to the context destination. And now we see in our beautiful visualizer, there's a link between the two. However, do you hear anything? I don't hear anything. Do you hear anything? I don't hear anything. No. That's because we haven't actually started the oscillator yet. So there is the concept in WebAudio of like creating a thing, but that doesn't mean you've set the thing in motion. So we've set up our oscillator, but we need to start it with os start. Now, just precaution. Now we hear a noise. Okay, we did it. We made sound. Now, what we're hearing is an A note. This is about 440 hertz. So this oscillator is moving back and forth 440 times a second, and that corresponds to what we'd call an A pitch, or what we hear as that note. If we want to change that, we can change the we can change the frequency value of the oscillator. So, for example, if I divide the frequency in half, we should hear an octave lower. And by the same token, if we multiply 440 by 2 and go up, I'm going to turn it down even further, we'll hear 2 octaves higher than this, 1 octave higher than our first note. So frequency corresponds to what we perceive as pitch of the sound. Now, the other thing we want to talk about when it comes to oscillators is their shape. Before we do that, however, try to go back to my, bright. Okay. One of those little words that seems so regular but has its own meaning is gain. So gain might be something you've seen like on a knob, on a speaker, or on some kind of home audio equipment. This is essentially how much we are amplifying, or turning it up to 11 maybe, or how much we're attenuating or turning down the volume or the energy which we perceive as volume of the signal. So this is essentially changing the amplitude of that wave in a way that we perceive as a change in volume. Now, similar to before, we can, oh no, not there yet. Trying to get back to my studio. Sorry for the white background. Okay, so we can add a gain node by using the context create gain method. So if we create a gain node and we have to do sort of fiddly things like gain.gain.value, so it is, to something smaller than 1, we will get a little bit quieter of a signal. And then what we can do is, instead of connecting the oscillator directly to the destination, we can connect the oscillator to the gain, and then the gain to the destination. So now we have a slightly less intense signal, and if I turn this way down, let's say, it gets even quieter. So this is useful, not only for not letting your ears bleed or your speakers blow out, but also for, as you're shaping a more and more complex sound, you can decide which parts are louder, which parts are softer. Now, the reason I wanted to add this gain node is because let's start playing around with different shapes of waves. What we're hearing is essentially a single note. This is because this is coming from a sine wave. which is basically the kind of natural form of sound waves. But if we change the, if we change the type of wave to, let's say, a triangle oscillator, we get a slightly different sound. Hear how it sounds kind of a different character? Now, there are other shapes that are even wilder, like a sawtooth wave. Hold on to your butts. This is why we put the gain in there, because this can be very jarring. Or a square wave. So you can see in our little visualizer here that these have different shapes if we look at the energy in the wave along the time spectrum. And a cool thing that we can do in this WebAudio Studio is add a little frequency visualizer here. And what this is doing is using, we can get into the digital signal processing in another talk, but this is using a fast Fourier transform, which is some fancy math to basically break down the signal in the time domain, where it shows us how much energy is in the wave at any point in time, and check which frequencies that maps to, and visualize how much energy or how loud each of those frequencies is in the frequency domain. So sort of a transformation that happens there. So now if we start the audio, we can see if I listen to I'm going to turn this down to a 220 again. And, I have to insert my frequency analyzer. A square wave has all kinds of stuff happening up here in the higher parts of the spectrum. But if I go back to my original sine wave, that all goes away. Really, all we hear, a bit quiet now, is like a single note. And as you can see, that corresponds to a peak in this frequency spectrum of the base frequency, or sometimes called the fundamental. But when we switch to one of these other shapes, it's creating all of these what are called harmonic frequencies. So all of these multiples of the base frequency, the fundamental, that essentially add more kind of depth or content to the sound. So this is more raw material we get to work with when we move on to step 2 of our sound journey, which is to shape the sound. So now we've got some raw material that we can work with. And in order to shape the sound, we can use something called a filter. Now, again, scary acronyms. VCF stands for voltage controlled filter. You might run across that in your audio readings. Again, we're not really thinking about voltage directly in this web context, but just like a filter on an array decides which elements of the array get to go through the filter and which ones get kept out by the filter, an audio filter does exactly the same thing for different frequencies on the spectrum. So an audio filter decides which of those frequencies are allowed to pass through the filter and which are not. And there are different shapes or different types of filters, just like there are different types of waves, but one common characteristic that they all have is something called a cutoff frequency. So this is sort of like a threshold, a particular frequency, either above which or below which it's going to start filtering out parts of the spectrum. And so, for example, something called a low-pass filter is going to allow anything that's lower than the cutoff to pass through. So it's going to just let it go. You're good. Carry on. Anything higher than the cutoff, though, is going to get toned down. It's going to get attenuated or reduced in energy. And there's a sort of a sloping curve. So the further away from the cutoff we are, the quieter that frequency will be in our output. And this is what's called the frequency response. So at any given frequency, a filter is characterized by what is its response at that frequency. Does it allow that frequency through? How much does it turn it down? That sort of thing. So similar to a low-pass filter, we could also have the opposite, which is a high-pass filter, which allows higher frequencies than the cutoff through, but doesn't allow the lower frequencies through. So let's take a look at this in the studio. So if we want to create a filter, shockingly, we have a context create filter. Sorry, it's not create filter, it's create biquad filter method. Now, again, this is where we start to dip our toes in. Like, there's a whole bunch of math you could get into if you wanted to about filter design. It's called a biquad filter because there's a couple quadratic equations that are doing the heavy lifting here. I don't know the details. I didn't need to know the details for this. I'm sure it's very interesting. Maybe some of you can explain it to me, but anyway, there's plenty you can read about it in like the WebAudio API spec and things like that. However, suffice it to say, this is going to give us something that is going to change the shape of the frequencies that we feed into it. So we need to connect it up, same as before. So I'm going to connect the oscillator to the filter. I'm going to connect the filter to the gain, and then the gain still to the destination. Now let's see if I did that right. Okay, so what we've got now, we can see that same kind of shape that we saw. This is a low pass filter by default. And if we add a visualizer here, we are going to see kind of what happens as we change the characteristics of the filter. So right now, the filter's cutoff frequency, which we can access as filter frequency, we can change the value of that. Right now, it's 350 hertz, so it's not that far away from our fundamental or our base frequency of 220 hertz. Let's raise it up a little bit. I don't know, let's make it like 600. See what happens. Did you hear a difference there? A little bit? Some nods, some nods. So if we look at this now, what we see is that there's kind of a, it's hard to see in units here, but I promise you this is our 220 base frequency. And then we have kind of not a lot happening at the lower end of the spectrum, but on the higher end, things gradually reduce down. So if we change this to like a high pass filter, let's say, which there's a convenient button for here, we hear a totally different sound. And we see a totally different shape. So now all of those higher frequencies are getting through. The lower frequencies are starting to be filtered out. In fact, now the main sound that we hear is no longer at our base fundamental frequency because that's been toned down by our high pass filter. So now we're really getting into the shape of sound, and this is, there's a ton of different shapes that we could play with here. A band pass filter is kind of like we're only letting in frequencies that are near the cutoff in a band around the cutoff. There are other shapes like a shelf filter, which sort of gives you a different curve. There's a lot of different things we could work with here. But suffice it to say, we're starting to get a feel for how we can shape sound. Now, where this gets really interesting is if we start to introduce resonance into our filters. So resonance, again, common word that we use a lot, but in the audio context, this refers to sort of amplifying particular frequencies. So like if you imagine an opera singer that hits that particular note that resonates with the crystal in the goblet that makes it crack, right? Something like that. We've got resonance at work there. In the context of filters, we can add resonance to a filter by adding a bit of amplification around the cutoff value. So we could sort of imagine this as like if our curve was sort of pushing down the higher frequencies of above a low pass filter cutoff, if we add resonance, we sort of pull up the frequencies around the cutoff, amplifying them, and that adds a whole other point of interest to the sound. So let's go back and check it out. So the resonance of a filter is represented by something called Q, which try to look up what it stands for. Ostensibly quality. Does it correspond to a meaningful unit? No. It's just a number that if it's higher, more resonance. I'm sure there's a scientific explanation for exactly how this came to be, but suffice it to say, you want resonance, up the Q. Be careful though, because this is really messing around with this is a great way to accidentally blow out your eardrums or your speakers or whatever else, just like that opera singer can make the glass crack. So take it easy on the Q values. That said, let's see what happens when we change the value of this Q to something like, well, 5, let's say. Okay, so notice that the shape of our filter now has that peak. And if we look at our analysis, we now are going to see that there is sort of an extra accented peak at whatever our cutoff frequency was. If we change that cutoff frequency, for example, to 800, maybe the careful listeners among you might have heard a very subtle difference in that sound, and it's perhaps a little easier to see if we look at the spectrum here, where we can see there's like a peak at a slightly higher frequency. And so this is now starting to really shape things. We're starting to be able to accentuate higher parts of the harmonics, and we're getting to our exciting third part of the sound journey, which is to move sound. Now, if we go into our, oh man, okay. If we go into our filters cutoff, for example, and I'm going to use this handy dandy knob that WebAudio Studio gives me to change this manually. It goes up, it sounds weird. It goes down, it sounds a different weird. What we're doing here is moving now the sound without changing anything about the fundamental. Just by tweaking the parameters of the filter, we can change the feeling of the sound dramatically. And this is what's called a filter sweep, which is a fun little piece of jargon. So once you're aware that this exists, I swear you're going to hear it everywhere. Like the Stranger Things theme music, for example, has a lot of filter sweeps. You'll hear this all over the place in electronic music. But this is something that's really cool, and artists who work with electronic music use this a lot in their tools. Now, where things get really exciting is when we can start automating this, right? Because I don't want to have to be physically twiddling the knobs. It's the web, so I can get it to do stuff for me. And to do that, I can use what's called an LFO, or low frequency oscillator, which in principle is exactly the same as the oscillator we used to make the sound in the first place. It just has, as it says on the tin, a much lower frequency. So instead of a frequency that's useful in our sound range, which is around, I want to say like 100 to 2,000 hertz or something like that, we're going to look at very, very small values. And that is going to allow us to do some pretty funky stuff. So I am going to avail myself, for the sake of time, from something else very handy that Alex has put in this awesome WebAudio Studio, which are some of these templates. So you can explore a lot of cool stuff here. And I'm going to avail myself of this LFO template. First, I'm going to turn off the oscillator. Okay, so let's just think about what's happening here. So just to let you know, we've essentially got all of the same stuff we had before. We have an oscillator creating noise, a filter shaping the sound, a gain node turning it down a little bit, and then the destination. The new part is we have another oscillator that we're calling LFO, created with the exact same create oscillator. This one, we can give it a triangle shape. We can give it whatever of those other shapes we want. But it has so much lower of a value. So instead of moving back and forth 220 times a second, this one is only moving back and forth once every 2 seconds, right? And what we can do then is take that value, which is going to be coming out of the oscillator from like +1 to -1, I think, and we can hook that up to another gain node, which essentially scales that signal up to kind of a useful level that we can use then as a parameter in our filter. So now we have an oscillator producing a signal that goes like +1, -1, +1, -1. We feed it into a gain node, which multiplies that by 600. So we go up 600, down 600, up 600, down 600. And if we connect our LFO and its gain to our filter's frequency, now we get that same sweep that we were doing manually to happen for us. So let us try it out. Can you hear it? I see some nods. Yeah. Okay, so now we've made sound. We're shaping the sound with a filter, and we are moving the sound with a low frequency oscillator. Whew, pretty cool. So now what happens if we combine 8 billion million versions of all of these different nodes? And there's some cool presets in here which you can play with. We're not going to go into the details, but like, check this out. I didn't make this, Alex Chris made this, but it's all the same building blocks. There's a couple other things happening in here which you can read about, but essentially from these small components, we're able to build infinitely complex sounds. And this is another example of like that ambient drone noise, right? Okay, amazing, and like huge thank you to Alex Chris for making this awesome studio. So now, if I have time, which I'm unsure of, we're going to talk about the rest of the owl. So as you get into web audio, you will see that this stuff all gets quite cumbersome quite quickly. And so there are some higher level libraries out there that make this a bit easier. One of them is Tone.js, which I think is really handy dandy. It's particularly handy dandy if you already know what you're doing with audio workflow stuff. But even if you don't, it's useful because it kind of helps you learn some of the general audio stuff that has nothing to do with the web, bringing it into the context of the WebAudio API. And so, for example, for the LFO stuff that we just did, if we're just using the WebAudio API, we had to like create oscillators, add a gain, pipe all this stuff together. Tone has some convenient classes, things like an LFO class, and I can just give it the frequency I want, the shape I want, the minimum and maximum values. I don't have to scale it with a gain or anything like that. And likewise, for filters, I can just pass in the params I want. And it has a lot of other convenient, handy-dandy things, so you can read all about it. We're not going to go into a ton of details, but basically, it's just piggybacking off of web audio and giving you a little higher level interface. So I have a work in progress, or you could say waves in progress project that is putting all this together, which is what came out months later of my Impossible Day adventures at RC. I'm calling it Here There. A little pun for you. Also a visual pun because my heart is here. And so let's see if we can tune in. The default setting is Berlin. Let's hear. Now, we're not in Berlin. I live in Berlin, but you probably don't. Let's check out what the weather's like in Leeds. Kind of similar. Let's check out what the weather's like in Dubai. More. How about, I don't know, Anchorage, Alaska? Different. All right, what is going on here? I'm not an artist like Quintron is, but I've tried to do something inspired by this Weather for the Blind project, the Weather Warlock, and what we've got is essentially all of those things that I just showed you, oscillators, filters, LFOs, a couple of other things like a delay, which just slows down parts of the sound, things like that. And we're letting a bunch of weather data drive it. So OpenMeteo has this very handy, completely free API. You can get weather from anywhere in the world. I'm using that to pull in a couple of parameters of weather that correspond to, this is my attempt at designing an instrument, 4 different voices that are each corresponding to earth, wind, air, fire. So we've got like temperature and the apparent temperature in the earth voice. We've got like, is it daytime? Is there cloud cover for fire? So on and so forth. Different, this is called parameter mappings from our data attributes to aspects of these filters and LFOs and things like that. And then each of those has its own gain volume slider. You can play around with them, you can turn them on and off, and they all merge together. So just to zoom into Earth real quick, just to show you that this is all the simple building blocks, what I've got is a triangle-shaped oscillator feeding sound into a high shelf filter, which is sort of like amplifying the higher parts above a particular cutoff. Then there's a bandpass filter that's sort of smoothing everything out a little bit. Then we have that resonant low-pass filter, exactly like we were just looking at, with an LFO sweeping the cutoff back and forth. And the parameter mapping I'm doing is I'm taking the temperature and using that to bump up the frequency of both the base oscillator and the cutoffs of the first couple filters. Tone.js provides a convenient like ramp to method where I can tell it, okay, take a second to like change this parameter. And then I'm doing the same thing with the LFO frequency, except using a little like a scaling factor of like what's the ratio between how it actually the temperature and like how it feels the temperature. So that's what's happening here. We're plugging in data into, like those cables plug into the different parameters of our building blocks that we get from the web audio, thanks to Tone.js for making that a little easier. And we get this soundscape. Do you like it? Do I like it? I don't know, but it exists, and you can tweak it. This is on GitHub. You can check out the code, you can judge it, and you can mess around with this stuff. But this is essentially what I wanted to share with you all. Sort of, I've been on this audio adventure the last 6 months or so, and what I found out is that sound can really, pun intended, make data resonate. Really give you a feeling of data rather than just looking at some like bars on a chart. Synthesis is scary, but it's not as scary as I thought it was. It is doable. There's small building blocks. There's amazing resources out there. There are infinite possibilities of what you can do with those small building blocks, and that's where the artistry comes in, which I have no idea how to teach, so if you find out, let me know. But WebAudio and Tone.js and other tools that folks have made can do all of this stuff. It's approachable. You can do it in your browser right now if you want to. It's not that scary. So I hope this has inspired you to go forth and poke around with the WebAudio API, go catch some waves, shape them, move them, and have fun with it. So huge thank you to everyone at the Recurse Center who held my hand and walked me through audio synthesis, especially Flavius and Joseph, my batchmates. And huge thank you to you all for listening and for All Day Hey for having me. I'm Anjana. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anjana. Wow, I feel like you could teach me basically any subject and make it interesting.